Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Taylor Petrey, editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Today, we're excited to have with us Keith Burns, who holds a master's in child development from Sarah Lawrence College and is working on a second master's in social work at Lehman College. In his new article, co-written with Linwood Lewis, Transcending Mormonism, Transgender Experiences in the LDS Church, Keith lays out the history of LDS policies and practices with respect to trans folk, and also interviews several trans or gender non-conforming Latter-day Saints to understand their experiences. Join us as we chat with Keith about his research and the implications of his work for understanding contemporary issues of gender in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Keith Burns, welcome. It's so nice to talk to you about your research.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I'm really grateful to be here as a fan, as a consumer of Dialogue. Very excited to be here.
Glad to have you, and thanks for your really fantastic work on this. This was such an interesting article. One of the very few articles on trans issues, so I congratulate you on your great work. So Keith, you note in your article that for a long time, Latter-day Saint leaders conflated homosexuality with trans identity. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Yeah, absolutely. It was really very interesting to dive into quotes from prominent 20th century Mormon leaders on sexuality and gender. And like you said, Taylor, the conflation of what we would now recognize today as trans experiences, conflating that with homosexuality. And Spencer Kimball was really one of several leaders that spent a lot of time addressing sexuality and gender. And actually, in the article, one of his most commonly cited quotes does just that. It conflates transgender people and people who identify as gay or lesbian. And he says, to paraphrase, that people who change their sex status will surely answer to their maker. And in talking about people who change their sex status, he's actually referring to, in his words, homosexuals. So for him, and very much the understanding of other church leaders, and I would assume church members at the time, was that a homosexual was equated with someone who changes their sex status. So it was really a gender problem, fundamentally, is what a homosexual was. It was someone who was failing to perform gender correctly. And then in Spencer Kimball's words, at the far extreme of that was someone who was actually changing, in his words, changing their sex status.
Why did church leaders care so much about gender, and how did they think that it related to biological sex? So these are sometimes overlapping terms, but tell us how they thought about it.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So church leaders were essentially conflating gender, sexuality, and all of the implications of a heterosexual gender identity with someone's biological sex. So if someone was biologically assigned male, that would mean that their gender identity was a cisgender man, and that their heterosexual desire for women was supposed to be a natural, in their mind, byproduct or result of that. And my understanding of why that was so crucial to Latter-day Saint leaders at the time, and then still is in slightly different scripts today, is just because of how important gender hierarchies really are to both kind of the pragmatic governance of the church, institutionally, and then also theologically with their claims and assertions about afterlife and how that's organized. So really, this kind of idea of a man presiding and in the home and presumably in the afterlife, I think really was an overarching and kind of governing theme of this really important fixation on gender and sexuality and kind of conflating it all into one.
So when did church leaders start talking about transgender or transsexuality? Again, these terms change a little bit over time. When did they start talking about it more explicitly, making policies about it, and kind of walk us up through some of the policy changes that have taken place over time?
Yeah, absolutely. Very important context there. So homosexuality, as I mentioned, really preceded discussions of trans issues. Homosexuality really entered into more Mormon discourse in the 1950s. And interestingly enough, it took about 30 years for the term transsexual was actually the term that LDS leaders began using in 1980. That entered into the handbook, the General Handbook, which is basically a handbook about policies and doctrines and procedures in the church. In 1980, a very vague line was inserted about transsexuals, and a punishment was associated with people who, quote, underwent transsexual operations. And that punishment was an automatic, non-negotiable excommunication. And that was 1980. And then you ask a great question about the shifting of that. From about 1980 to 2010, there were about 3 or 4 modifications to that handbook language. And it wasn't so much changing the effects of the language, more so just softening it and using a little bit gentler language. Several years later I believe it was 1984, church leaders said that the first presidency could now review cases of transsexual operations, which kind of took that blow off just a little bit of an excommunication being final and non-negotiable. And then throughout time, you just saw language just get a little more softer and less kind of harsh. But it still made clear, and still does today, that transitioning away from what they would call as one's biological, sex is not acceptable and can lead to church discipline.
So some things did change in 2020. Can you just kind of walk us through the basics of the policy changes that were announced then?
Yeah, absolutely. So they definitely doubled down on this idea that transitioning is not acceptable. However, there were some noteworthy changes. I'll start with some changes that people like myself and other trans activists and trans and gender nonconforming people see as positive or hopeful. In 2020, church leaders made clear in the handbook that a trans or gender nonconforming person could start being referred to by their preferred name in their local congregation, and if they listed their preferred name or pronouns, that those should be respected. This is really a monumental shift in my mind, because just several years prior to 2020, there were prominent leaders very much discouraging against pronoun changes, name changes, Dallin Oaks being one of them, who really made clear that was not acceptable. And now here in 2020, there's a very marked shift towards acceptance of that. However, there was also a change that definitely raised some eyebrows and is still kind of hard to understand in my mind. But in addition to being against what they call physical transition, which I assume they mean, surgery and or some kind of physical alteration of someone's body, they also added in the 2020 handbook sanctions for social transitioning. that's a new phrase in the church's handbook, and it's not fully clear what they mean by social transitioning. They didn't really elaborate on that, and actually, some of my participants in the article discuss kind of the ambiguity of what that means to social transition. How do you really police what a social transition is? Is it, hair length, earrings, makeup? So that's in there. And they, church leaders assert that a social transition would also be grounds for membership restrictions or discipline, just as a physical transition would.
So let's turn to some of your subjects. You interviewed several people that between the ages of 18 and 44, so sort of younger to middle-aged there. And you mentioned that it revealed a huge diversity of ways that trans folk describe their experiences. We've already mentioned the way that the church is kind of distinguishing now between social and medical or physical transitions. Can you talk a little bit about what you found, how trans people tend to be identifying, at least of those that you surveyed and interviewed?
Yes, absolutely. That was one of the most interesting parts of my interviews, is just how differently people were interacting with the concept of transness. In fact, to be perfectly candid, coming up with the title of the piece was difficult because I had a few participants who didn't identify as trans or with the concept of transness. So I was using trans as kind of an umbrella term, but also recognizing the complexity of the term, in that various individuals I was interviewing were not resonating with that term for their identity. So I'll get into that in a little more detail. Something that really stood out to me was this idea that some people were very much connected to the concept of a gender binary, and some people were very distant from that concept of gender binary, very much subverting and resisting the gender binary. So, for example, the 44-year-old participant that I quote and reference a lot of, her name is Juliana. Juliana talks very extensively about her sense of femaleness. Now, Juliana was assigned male at birth and identifies as a woman. And she just had these very beautiful and moving portrayals of how much she resonated with a female identity. On the flip side, I had people like Emily, for example, who was very much in this position of their gender, their connection with masculinity, femininity, or neither, really moves in and out of context and spaces and time, and very much differs. And someone like Emily was not feeling connected to really any stable sense of gender identity. So yeah, those are just a few examples of the very drastically different ways of relating to gender and relating to the label trans.
That's super interesting, and this I think is helpful as we lead into the next part of this too. How did these members that you were researching? Some seem to have disaffiliated, some were active. What is the answer of how the trans folks that you were working with experience? What were their experiences in the church?
Yeah, $1 million question there. That was probably the messiest part of my interviews, was getting a sense of people's relationships with the church. It was very complicated, very all over the map, so to speak. It was a relatively small sample size, so I do acknowledge that in terms of it not really being able to say anything quantitative about trans experiences in the church. That being said, I would say one or two of my participants made it very clear that the church was an important, significant part of their life and their worship experiences. I would say probably about the same one or two had very much distanced themselves from the LDS Church and had some feelings of, even some feelings of resentment and anger toward the church and its policies, which of course is very understandable. And then probably the rest of the people were floating somewhere in the middle. I had a few BYU students who, had a messy relationship with the church because, at least in part because of BYU's guidelines around church attendance. And then I just had some other people who were kind of in a state of sifting through church teachings that they found very meaningful and relevant to them, and very much letting go of and rejecting teachings that they deemed harmful. And I talk about this kind of cafeteria Mormonism in the article, and that kind of pick and choose mindset for, I'd say, 2 or 3 of the people I interviewed was actually providing a space where they could continue to engage somewhat healthily with the church. So yeah, it was very, very different set of experiences there and feelings about the church and its teachings on gender.
So you conclude your article with some recommendations to reduce the conflicts between the church and its trans members. And I'll just quote something that you say: for the church to be a safe, welcoming, and embracing space for trans individuals, leaders need to reconstruct God's divine plan, either without the concept of a fixed eternal gender, or at least with the acknowledgement that all gender identities/experiences are equally valid in God's eyes. Can you talk a little bit about more what you mean here?
Yeah, appreciate you bringing that quote in, because I would say that's kind of my central argument, at least one of several. And what I mean by that is, in order for the church to really provide a safe, welcoming, and inclusive space for all different people across, spanning gender identities, I really think that we have to kind of go back to the drawing board of the plan of salvation, so to speak, and create a concept of eternal glory or eternal progression that isn't so inseparably linked to one's gender identity. Now, some people look at me and say, you're crazy. The church has been teaching for years, the importance of, gender and sexuality and its implications on eternal families and the afterlife. So I get that. Although I don't think that a pivot away from a core social category and its implications on the afterlife is new to Latter-day Saints. And in fact, Taylor, in your book, I feel like you very masterfully lay out the history of, racial teachings and talk about, obviously, its implications for sexuality and gender and some overlaps in discourse. And I think in the same way the church kind of untethered skin color from its afterlife theology to the point where they will say in 2023 that the color of your skin has absolutely nothing to do with your devotion to God and your position in the afterlife. That's kind of where I'm coming from with that quote, and is that we can have a similar transition and say, look, how someone identifies in terms of their gender and in terms of their sexual preferences has nothing to do with the depth of one's character and one's ability to serve, to grow, to learn, all really core features of Mormonism. So we can really just embrace those kind of common values that I think so many Latter-day Saints have, and then just kind of disconnect it from social demographics like race and gender identity that just seem to cause so much exclusion and oppression and harm.
So, Keith, we find ourselves in 2023 in a kind of, I would say, fraught political moment around trans issues, where we're seeing a real attack on trans rights, trans identity, trans existence in some cases here. How do you think the church might better sort of position itself in the political environment on some of these topics? This is not something that you write about, but I'll just, ask here.
Yeah. Very important question. And I feel like I think the church can have significant impact in this arena. I agree with you that trans rights have been under just blatant attack in recent months and in recent past few years. And the church, in my mind, especially in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, has really tried to, I think, take on a more moderate political image. I'm definitely no political scientist, but that's just kind of my, layperson's perspective. You have President Nelson, talking about the importance of masks and vaccines. You have statements that are relatively pro-immigration. I say relatively, for kind of general church perspectives. I definitely see the church kind of from a top-down level trying to distance themselves from kind of right-wing extremism, conspiracy stuff. And does that always reach down to the members? Not necessarily. However, I do think the church has a lot of power at the top to kind of brand our political image. And in the arena of sexuality and gender, particularly trans issues and trans rights, I do see them saying some better things at the pulpit and, talking about inclusivity and love and compassion, which I think is a decent start. I would definitely like to see them continue coming out. They recently came out in support of, same-sex, the Defense of Marriage Act in Utah, supporting same-sex marriage. Some people are skeptical of their, interest with that. I think it's a decent step in the right direction. And I would like, continued more specific affirmations of policies that provide legal and civil, protections for trans people. I mean, asking them to shift their doctrinal perspective is probably a lot, but I think they can at least, be a very clear advocate of civil and, legal rights for trans people.
Keith, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's been a huge pleasure learning about your research on such an important topic right now. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Taylor. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to ask these very thoughtful questions.
We hope that our listeners have enjoyed this conversation and have learned something new about the experiences and history of trans Latter-day Saints. If you'd like to learn more, we encourage you to check out Keith Burns and Linwood Lewis, Transcending Mormonism, Transgender Experiences in the LDS Church in the spring 2023 issue of Dialogue, and explore other resources on this topic on our website. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope you'll tune in for future episodes of our podcast, and be sure to check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network. Thanks.